Chapter 6 Concerning the heresies and divisions that troubled the Church during this century. Among the many sects which divided the Christian Church during this century, it is natural to mention, in the first place, that which an attachment to the Mosaic law separated from the rest of their Christian brethren. The first rise of this sect is placed under the reign of Adrian. For, when this emperor had, at length, razed Jerusalem, entirely destroyed even its very foundations, and enacted laws of the severest kind against the whole body of the Jewish people, the greatest part of the Christians who lived in Palestine, to prevent their being confounded with the Jews, abandoned entirely the Mosaic rites, and chose a bishop, named Mark, a foreigner by nation, and consequently an alien from the commonwealth of Israel. This step was highly shocking to those whose attachment to the Mosaic rites was violent and invincible, and such was the case of many. These, therefore, separated themselves from the brethren, and founded at Pera, a country of Palestine, and in the neighboring parts, particular assemblies, in which the law of Moses maintained its primitive dignity, authority, and luster. This body of Judaizing Christians, which set Christ and Moses upon an equal footing, in point of authority, was afterward divided into two sects, extremely different both in their rites and in their opinions, and distinguished by the names of Nazarenes and Ebionites. The former are not placed by the ancient Christians in the heretical register, but the latter were considered as a sect whose tenets were destructive of the fundamental principles of the Christian religion. These sects made use of a gospel or history of Christ, different from that which is received among us, and concerning which there have been many disputes among the learned. The term Nazarenes was not originally the name of a sect, but that which distinguished the disciples of Jesus in general. And as those whom the Greeks called Christians received the name of Nazarenes among the Jews, this latter name was not considered as a mark of ignominy or contempt. Those, indeed, who, after their separation from their brethren, retained the title of Nazarenes, differed much from the true disciples of Christ, to whom that name had been originally given. They held that Christ was born of a virgin, and was also in a certain manner united to the divine nature. They refused to abandon the ceremonies prescribed by the law of Moses, but were far from attempting to impose the observance of these ceremonies upon the Gentile Christians. They rejected also all those additions that were made to the Mosaic institutions by the Pharisees and the doctors of the law, and from hence we may easily see the reason why the greatest part of the Christians treated the Nazarenes with a more than ordinary degree of gentleness and forbearance. It is a doubtful matter from whence the Ebionites derived their name, whether from that of some of their principal doctors, or from their poverty. One thing, however, is certain, and that is, that their sentiments and doctrines were much more pernicious than those of the Nazarenes. For though they believed the celestial mission of Christ, and his participation of a divine nature, yet they regarded him as a man born of Joseph and Mary, according to the ordinary course of nature. They, moreover, asserted that the ceremonial law, instituted by Moses, was not only obligatory upon the Jews, but also upon all others, and that the observance of it was essential to salvation. And as St. Paul had very different sentiments from them, concerning the obligation of the ceremonial law, and had opposed the observance of it in the warmest manner, so of consequence they held this apostle in abhorrence, and treated his writings with the utmost disrespect. Nor were they only attached to the rites instituted by Moses, they went still further, and received, with an equal degree of veneration, the superstitions of their ancestors, and the ceremonies and traditions which the Pharisees presumptuously added to the law. These obscure and unfrequented heretical assemblies were very little detrimental to the Christian cause, which suffered much more from those sects whose leaders explained the doctrines of Christianity in a manner conformable to the dictates of the Oriental philosophy concerning the origin of evil. The Oriental doctors, who, before this century had lived in the greatest obscurity, came forth from their retreat under the reign of Adrian, exposed themselves to public view, and gathered together, in various provinces, assemblies whose numbers were very considerable. The ancient records mention a great number of these demi-Christian sects, many of which are no further known than by their distinguishing names, which, perhaps, is the only circumstance in which they differ from each other. One division, however, of these Oriental Christians, may be considered as real and important, since the two branches it produced were vastly superior to the rest in reputation, and made more noise in the world, than the other multiplied subdivisions of this pernicious sect. Of this famous division, one branch, which arose in Asia, preserved the Oriental doctrine concerning the origin of the world, unmixed with other sentiments and opinions, while the other, which was formed in Egypt, made a motley mixture of this philosophy with the tenets and prodigies adopted in the religious system of that superstitious country. The doctrine of the former surpassed in simplicity and perspicuity that of the latter, which consisted of a vast variety of parts, so artfully combined, that the explication of them became a matter of much difficulty. Among the doctors of the Asiatic branch, the first place is due to Ecclesiastes, a Jew, who, during the reign of Trajan, is said to have formed the sect of the Ecclesiastics. This heretic, though a Jew, attached to the worship of one God, and full of veneration for Moses, corrupted, nevertheless, the religion of his ancestors, by blending with it a multitude of fictions drawn from the Oriental philosophy, pretending also, after the example of the Essenes, to give a rational explication of the law of Moses, he reduced it to a mere allegory. It is, at the same time, proper to observe, that some have doubted whether the Ecclesiastics are to be reckoned among the Christian or the Jewish sects, and Epiphanius, who was acquainted with a certain production of Ecclesiastes, expresses his uncertainty in this matter. Ecclesiastes, indeed, in that book, mentions Christ with the highest encomiums, without, however, adding any circumstance from whence it might be concluded with certainty that Jesus of Nazareth was the Christ of whom he spoke. If then Ecclesiastes be improperly placed among the leaders of the sect now under consideration, we may place at its head Saturninus of Antioch, who is one of the first Gnostic chiefs mentioned in history. He held the doctrine of two principles from whence proceeded all things, the one a wise and benevolent deity, and the other, matter, a principle essentially evil, and which he supposed under the superintendence of a certain intelligence of a malignant nature. The world and its first inhabitants were, according to the system of this raving philosopher, created by 7 angels, which presided over the 7 planets. This work was carried on without the knowledge of the benevolent deity, and in opposition to the will of the material principle. The former, however, beheld it with approbation, and honored it with several marks of his beneficence. He endowed with rational souls the beings who inhabited this new system, to whom their creators had imparted nothing more than the mere animal life, and having divided the world into 7 parts, he distributed them among the 7 angelic architects, one of whom was the God of the Jews, and reserved to himself the supreme empire over all. To these creatures, whom the benevolent principle had endowed with reasonable souls, and with dispositions that led to goodness and virtue, the evil being, to maintain his empire, added another kind, whom he formed of a wicked and malignant character, and hence the difference we see among men. When the creators of the world fell from their allegiance to the supreme deity, God sent from heaven into our globe, a restorer of order, whose name was Christ. This divine conqueror came clothed with a corporeal appearance, but not with a real body. He came to destroy the empire of the material principle, and to point out to virtuous souls the way by which they must return to God. This way is beset with difficulties and sufferings, since those souls who propose returning to the Supreme Being after the dissolution of this mortal body, must abstain from wine, flesh, wedlock, and, in short, from everything that tends to sensual gratification, or even bodily refreshment. Saturninus taught these extravagant doctrines in Syria, but principally at Antioch, and drew after him many disciples by the pompous appearance of an extraordinary virtue. Cerdo the Syrian, and Mark Ion, son to the bishop of Pontus, belonged to the Asiatic sect, though they began to establish their doctrine at Rome, and having given a turn somewhat different to the Oriental superstition, may themselves be considered as the heads of a new sect which bears their names. Amid the obscurity and doubts that render so uncertain the history of these 2 men, the following fact is incontestable, viz. That Cerdo had been spreading his doctrine at Rome before the arrival of Mark Ion there, and that the latter having, through his own misconduct, forfeited a place to which he aspired in the Church of Rome, attached himself, through resentment, to the impostor Cerdo, and propagated his impious doctrines with an astonishing success throughout the world. After the example of the Oriental doctors, they held the existence of 2 principles, the one perfectly good, and the other perfectly evil. Between these, they imagined an intermediate kind of deity, neither perfectly good nor perfectly evil, but of a mixed nature, so Mark Ion expresses it, and so far just and powerful, as to administer rewards and inflict punishments. This middle deity is the creator of this inferior world, and the God and legislator of the Jewish nation. He wages perpetual war with the evil principle, and both the one and the other aspire to the place of the Supreme Being, and ambitiously attempt subjecting to their authority all the inhabitants of the world. The Jews are the subjects of that powerful genius who formed this globe. The other nations, who worship a variety of gods, are under the empire of the evil principle. Both these conflicting powers exercise oppressions upon rational and immortal souls, and keep them in a tedious and miserable captivity. Therefore the Supreme God, in order to terminate this war, and to deliver from their bondage those souls whose origin is celestial and divine, sent to the Jews a being most like unto himself, even his Son Jesus Christ, clothed with a certain shadowy resemblance of a body, that thus he might be visible to mortal eyes. The commission of this celestial messenger was to destroy the empire both of the evil principle, and of the author of this world, and to bring back wandering souls to God. On this account, he was attacked, with inexpressible violence and fury by the Prince of Darkness, and by the God of the Jews, but without effect, since, having a body only in appearance, he was thereby rendered incapable of suffering. Those who follow the sacred directions of this celestial conductor, mortify the body by fastings and austerities, call off their minds from the allurements of sense, and, renouncing the precepts of the God of the Jews, and of the Prince of Darkness, turn their eyes toward the Supreme Being, shall, after death, ascend to the mansions of felicity and perfection. In consequence of all this, the rule of manners, which Mark Ion prescribed to his followers, was excessively austere, containing an express prohibition of wedlock, of the use of wine, flesh, and of all the external comforts of life. Notwithstanding the rigor of this severe discipline, great numbers embraced the doctrines of Mark Ion, of whom Lucan, or Lucian, Severus, Blasts, and principally Apelles, are said to have varied, in some things, from the opinions of their master, and to have formed new sections. Bardesanes and Tatian are commonly supposed to have been of the school of Valentine the Egyptian. But this notion is entirely without foundation, since their doctrine differs in many things from that of the Valentinians, approaching nearer to that of the Oriental philosophy concerning the two principles. Bardesanes, native of Edessa, was a man of a very acute genius, and acquired a shining reputation by his writings, which were in great number, and valuable for the profound erudition they contained. Seduced by the fantastic charms of the Oriental philosophy, he adopted it with zeal, but, at the same time, with certain modifications, that rendered his system less extravagant than that of the Marcionites, against whom he wrote a very learned treatise. The sum of his doctrine is as follows: there is a supreme God, pure and benevolent, absolutely free from all evil and imperfection, and there is also a Prince of Darkness, the fountain of all evil, disorder, and misery. The supreme God created the world without any mixture of evil in its composition. He gave existence also to its inhabitants, who came out of his forming hand, pure and incorrupt, endued with subtle, ethereal bodies, and spirits of a celestial nature. But when, in process of time, the Prince of Darkness had enticed men to sin, then the supreme God permitted them to fall into sluggish and gross bodies, formed of corrupt matter by the evil principle. He permitted also the depravation and disorder which this malignant being introduced both into the natural and the moral world, designing, by this permission, to punish the degeneracy and rebellion of an apostate race. And hence proceeds the perpetual conflict between reason and passion in the mind of man. It was on this account, that Jesus descended from the upper regions, clothed not with a real, but with a celestial and aerial body, and taught mankind to subdue that body of corruption which they carry about with them in this mortal life, and, by abstinence, fasting, and contemplation, to disengage themselves from the servitude and dominion of that malignant matter, which chained down the soul to low and ignoble pursuits. Those who hear the voice of this divine instructor, and submit themselves to his discipline, shall, after the dissolution of this terrestrial body, mount up to the mansions of felicity, clothed with ethereal vehicles or celestial bodies. Such was the doctrine of Bardesanes, who afterward abandoned the chimerical part of this system, and returned to a better mind, though his sect subsisted a long time in Syria. Tatian, by birth an Assyrian, and a disciple of Justin Martyr, is more distinguished, by the ancient writers, on account of his genius and learning, and the excessive and incredible austerity of his life and manners, than by any remarkable errors or opinions which he taught his followers. It appears, however, from the testimony of credible writers, that Tatian looked upon matter as the fountain of all evil, and therefore recommended, in a particular manner, the mortification of the body, that he distinguished the Creator of the world from the Supreme Being, denied the reality of Christ's body, and corrupted the Christian religion with several other tenets of the Oriental philosophy. He had a great number of followers, who were, after him, called Tatianists, but were, nevertheless, more frequently distinguished from other sects by names relative to the austerity of their manners. For as they rejected, with a sort of horror, all the comforts and conveniences of life, and abstained from wine with such a vigorous obstinacy, as to use nothing but water even at the celebration of the Lord's Supper, as they macerated their bodies by continual fastings, and lived a severe life of celibacy and abstinence, so they were called Encratites, Hydroperistates, and Apotactites. Hitherto, we have only considered the doctrine of the Asiatic Gnostics. Those of the Egyptian branch differ from them in general in this, that they blended into one mass the Oriental philosophy and the Egyptian theology, the former of which the Asiatics preserved unmixed in its original simplicity. The Egyptians were, moreover, particularly distinguished from the Asiatic Gnostics, by the following difference in their religious system, viz. 1. That though, beside the existence of a deity, they maintained that also of an eternal matter, endued with life and motion, yet they did not acknowledge an eternal principle of darkness, or the evil principle of the Persians. 2. They supposed that our blessed Saviour was a compound of two persons, of the man Jesus, and of Christ the Son of God, that the divine nature entered into the man Jesus, when he was baptized by John in the river Jordan, and departed from him when he was seized by the Jews. 3. They attributed to Christ a real, not an imaginary body, though it must be confessed, that they were much divided in their sentiments on this head. 4. Their discipline, with respect to life and manners, was much less severe than those of the Asiatic sect, and seems, in some points, to have been favorable to the corruption and passions of men. Basilides has generally obtained the first place among the Egyptian Gnostics. He acknowledged the existence of one supreme God, perfect in goodness and wisdom, who produced from his own substance 7 beings, or eons, of a most excellent nature. 2 of these eons, called Dynamis and Sophia, i.e. power and wisdom, engendered the angels of the highest order. These angels formed a heaven for their habitation, and brought forth other angelic beings, of a nature somewhat inferior to their own. Many other generations of angels followed these. New heavens were also created, until the number of angelic orders, and of their respective heavens, amounted to 365, and thus equaled the days of the year. All these are under the empire of an omnipotent Lord, whom Basilides called Abraxas. This word, which was certainly in use among the Egyptians before his time, contains numeral letters to the amount of 365, and thereby expresses the number of heavens and angelic orders above mentioned. The inhabitants of the lowest heavens, which touched upon the borders of the eternal, malignant, and self-animated matter, conceived the design of forming a world from that confused mass, and of creating an order of beings to people it. This design was carried into execution, and was approved by the Supreme God, who, to the animal life, with which only the inhabitants of this new world were at first endowed, added a reasonable soul, giving at the same time, to the angels, the empire over them. These angelic beings, advanced to the government of the world which they had created, fell, by degrees, from their original purity, and manifested soon the fatal marks of their depravity and corruption. They not only endeavored to efface in the minds of men the knowledge of the Supreme Being, that they might be worshipped in his stead, but also began to war against one another, with an ambitious view to enlarge, every one, the bounds of his respective dominion. The most arrogant and turbulent of all these angelic spirits, was that which presided over the Jewish nation. Hence the Supreme God, beholding with compassion the miserable state of rational beings, who groaned under the contests of these jarring powers, sent from heaven his Son Nous, or Christ, the chief of the eons, that, joined in a substantial union with the man Jesus, he might restore the knowledge of the Supreme God, destroy the empire of those angelic natures which presided over the world, and particularly that of the arrogant leader of the Jewish people. The God of the Jews, alarmed at this, sent forth his ministers to seize the man Jesus, and put him to death. They executed his commands, but their cruelty could not extend to Christ, against whom their efforts were vain. Those souls, who obey the precepts of the Son of God, shall, after the dissolution of their mortal frame, ascend to the Father, while their bodies return to the corrupt mass of matter from whence they were formed. Disobedient spirits, on the contrary, shall pass successively into other bodies. The doctrine of Basilides, in point of morals, if we may credit the account of most ancient writers, was favorable to the lusts and passions of mankind, and permitted the practice of all sorts of wickedness. But those whose testimonies are the most worthy of regard, give a quite different account of this teacher, and represent him as recommending the practice of virtue and piety in the strongest manner, and as having condemned not only the actual commission of iniquity, but even every inward propensity of the mind to a vicious conduct. It is true, there were, in his precepts relating to the conduct of life, some things which gave great offense to all true Christians. For he affirmed it to be lawful for them to conceal their religion, to deny Christ, when their lives were in danger, and to partake of the feasts of the Gentiles that were instituted in consequence of the sacrifices offered to idols. He endeavored also to diminish the glory of those who suffered martyrdom for the cause of Christ, impiously maintained, that they were more heinous sinners than others, and that their sufferings were to be looked upon as a punishment inflicted upon them by the divine justice. Though he was led into this enormous error, by an absurd notion that all the calamities of this life were of a penal nature, and that men never suffered but in consequence of their iniquities, yet this rendered his principles greatly suspected, and the irregular lives of some of his disciples seemed to justify the unfavorable opinion that was entertained concerning their master. But whatever may be said of Basilides, it is certain, that he was far surpassed in impiety by Carpocrates, who was also of Alexandria, and who carried the Gnostic blasphemies to a more enormous degree of extravagance than they had ever been brought by any of that sect. His philosophical tenets agree, in general, with those of the Egyptian Gnostics. He acknowledged the existence of a supreme God, and of the eons derived from him by successive generations. He maintained the eternity of a corrupt matter, and the creation of the world from thence by angelic powers, as also the divine origin of souls unhappily imprisoned in mortal bodies, etc. But, beside these, he propagated other sentiments and maxims of a horrid kind. He asserted that Jesus was born of Joseph and Mary, according to the ordinary course of nature, and was distinguished from the rest of mankind by nothing but his superior fortitude and greatness of soul. His doctrine also, with respect to practice, was licentious in the highest degree, for he not only allowed his disciples a full liberty to sin, but recommended to them a vicious course of life, as a matter both of obligation and necessity, asserting, that eternal salvation was only attainable by those who had committed all sorts of crimes, and had daringly filled up the measure of iniquity. It is almost incredible, that one who maintained the existence of a supreme being, who acknowledged Christ as the Savior of mankind, could entertain such monstrous opinions as these. One would infer, indeed, from certain tenets of Carpocrates, that he adopted the common doctrine of the Gnostics concerning Christ, and acknowledged also the laws which this divine Savior imposed upon his disciples. But notwithstanding this, it is beyond all doubt, that the precepts and opinions of this Gnostic are full of impiety, since he held, that lusts and passions, being implanted in our nature by God himself, were consequently void of guilt, and had nothing criminal in them, that all actions were indifferent in their own nature, and were rendered good or evil only by the opinions of men, or by the laws of the state, that it was the will of God, that all things should be possessed in common, the female sex not excepted, but that human laws, by an arbitrary tyranny, branded those as robbers, and adulterers, who only used their natural rights. It is easy to perceive, that, by these tenets, all the principles of virtue were destroyed, and a door opened to the most horrid licentiousness, and to the most profligate and enormous wickedness. Valentine, who was likewise an Egyptian by birth, was eminently distinguished from all his brethren by the extent of his fame, and the multitude of his followers. His sect, which took rise at Rome, grew up to a state of consistence and vigor in the Isle of Cyprus, and spread itself through Asia, Africa, and Europe, with an amazing rapidity. The principles of Valentine were, generally speaking, the same with those of the Gnostics, whose name he assumed, yet in many things he entertained opinions that were particular to himself. He placed, for instance, in the Pleroma, so the Gnostics called the habitation of the deity, 30 eons, of which the one half were male, and the other female. To these he added 4 others, which were of neither sex, viz. Horus, who guarded the borders of the Pleroma, Christ, the Holy Ghost and Jesus. The youngest of the Aeons, called Sophia, i.e., wisdom, conceived an ardent desire of comprehending the nature of the Supreme Being, and, by the force of this propensity, brought forth a daughter, named Achamoth. Achamoth, being exiled from the Pleroma, fell down into the rude and undigested mass of matter, to which she gave a certain arrangement, and, by the assistance of Jesus, produced the Demiurge, the Lord and Creator of all things. This Demiurge separated the subtle or animal matter from that of the grosser, or more terrestrial kind. Out of the former he created the superior world, or the visible heavens, and out of the latter he formed the inferior world, or this terraqueous globe. He also made man, in whose composition the subtle and also the grosser matter were both united, and that in equal portions, but Achamoth, the mother of Demiurge, added to these two substances, of which the human race was formed, a spiritual and celestial substance. This is the sum of that intricate and tedious fable, that the extravagant brain of Valentine imposed upon the world for a system of religious philosophy, and from this it appears, that, though he explained the origin of the world and of the human race in a more subtle manner than the other Gnostics, yet he did not differ from them in reality. His imagination was more wild and inventive than that of his brethren, and this is manifest in the whole of his doctrine, which is no more than Gnosticism, set out with some supernumerary fringes, as will further appear from what follows. The Creator of this world, according to Valentine, arrived, by degrees, to that pitch of arrogance, that he either imagined himself to be God alone, or, at least, was desirous that mankind should consider him as such. For this purpose, he sent forth prophets to the Jewish nation, to enforce his claim to the honor that is due to the Supreme Being, and in this also the other angels that preside over the different parts of the universe immediately set themselves to imitate his ambition. To chastise this lawless arrogance of Demiurge, and to illuminate the minds of rational beings with the knowledge of the true and supreme deity, Christ appeared upon earth, composed of an animal and spiritual substance, and clothed, moreover, with an aerial body. This Redeemer, in descending upon earth, passed through the womb of Mary, as the pure water flows through the untainted conduit. Jesus, one of the supreme Aeons, was substantially united to him, when he was baptized by John in the waters of Jordan. The Creator of this world, when he perceived that the foundations of his empire were shaken by this divine man, caused him to be apprehended and nailed to the cross. But before Christ submitted to this punishment, not only Jesus the Son of God, but also the rational soul of Christ, ascended up on high, so that only the animal soul and the ethereal body suffered crucifixion. Those who, abandoning the service of false deities, and the worship of the God of the Jews, live according to the precepts of Christ, and submit the animal and sensual soul to the discipline of reason, shall be truly happy. Their rational and also their sensual souls shall ascend to those glorious seats of bliss which border on the Pleroma, and when all the parts of the divine nature, or all souls are purified thoroughly and separated from matter, then a raging fire, let loose from its prison, shall spread its flames throughout the universe, and dissolve the frame of this corporeal world. Such is the doctrine of Valentine and the Gnostics, such also are the tenets of the Oriental philosophy, and they may be summed up in the following propositions: this world is a compound of good and evil. Whatever is good in it, comes down from the Supreme God the Father of lights, and to him it shall return, and then the world shall be entirely destroyed. We learn from ancient writers, that the sect of the Valentinians was divided into many branches. One of these was the sect of Ptolemaites, so called from their chief Ptolemy, who differed in opinion from his master Valentine, with respect to both the number and nature of the Aeons. Another of these was the sect of the Secundians, whose chief Secundus, one of the principal followers of Valentine, maintained the doctrine of two eternal principles, viz. Light and darkness, from whence arose the good and the evil that are observable in the universe. From the same source arose the sect of Heracleon, from whose writings Clemens and Origen have made many extracts, as also that of the Marcosians, whose leaders Mark and Calabarsus added many absurd fictions to those of Valentine, though it is certain, at the same time, that many errors were attributed to them, which they did not maintain. I omit the mention of some other sects, to which the Valentinian heresy is said to have given rise. Whether, in reality, they all sprung from this source, is a question of a very doubtful kind, especially if we consider the errors into which the ancients have fallen, in tracing out the origin of the various sects that divided the Church. It is not necessary to take any particular notice of the more obscure and less considerable of the Gnostic sects, of which the ancient writers scarcely mention anything but the name, and one or two of their distinguishing tenets. Such were the Adamites, who are said to have professed an exact imitation of the primitive state of innocence, the Cainites, who treated as saints, with the utmost marks of admiration and respect, Cain, Korah, Dathan, the inhabitants of Sodom, and even the traitor Judas. Such also were the Abelites, who entered into the bonds of matrimony, but neglected to fulfill its principal end, even the propagation of offspring, the Sethites, who honored Seth in a particular manner, and looked upon him as the same person with Christ, the Florinians, who had Florinus and Blastus for their chiefs, and several others. It is highly probable, that the ancient doctors, deceived by the variety of names that distinguish the heretics, may with too much precipitation have divided one sect into many. Nay, it may be further questioned, whether they have, at all times, represented accurately the nature and true meaning of several opinions concerning which they have written. The Ophites, or Serpentinians, a ridiculous sort of heretics, who had for their leader a man called Euphrates, deserve not the lowest place among the Egyptian Gnostics. This sect, which had its origin among the Jews, was of a more ancient date than the Christian religion. A part of its followers embraced the gospel, while the other retained their primitive superstition, and from hence arose the division of the Ophites into Christian and anti-Christian. The Christian Ophites entertained almost the same fantastic opinions that were held by the other Egyptian Gnostics, concerning the aeons, the eternal matter, the creation of the world in opposition to the will of God, the rulers of the 7 planets that presided over this world, the tyranny of Demiurge, and also concerning Christ united to the man Jesus, in order to destroy the empire of this usurper. But beside these, they maintained the following particular tenet, from whence also they received the name of Ophites, viz. That the serpent, by which our first parents were deceived, was either Christ himself, or Sophia, concealed under the form of that animal, and in consequence of this opinion, they are said to have nourished a certain number of serpents, which they looked upon as sacred, and to which they offered a sort of worship, a subordinate kind of divine honors. It was no difficult matter for those, who made a distinction between the Supreme Being and the Creator of the world, and who looked upon everything as divine, which was in opposition to Demiurge, to fall into these extravagant notions. The schisms and commotions that arose in the Church, from a mixture of the Oriental and Egyptian philosophy with the Christian religion, were, in the 2nd century, increased by those Grecian philosophers who embraced the doctrine of Christ. The Christian doctrine, concerning the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, and the two natures united in our blessed Saviour, were, by no means, reconcilable with the tenets of the sages and doctors of Greece, who therefore endeavored to explain them in such a manner as to render them comprehensible. Praxeas, a man of genius and learning, began to propagate these explications at Rome, and was severely persecuted for the errors they contained. He denied any real distinction between the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, and maintained that the Father, sole creator of all things, had united to himself the human nature of Christ. Hence his followers were called Monarchians, because of their denying a plurality of persons in the deity, and also Patripassians, because, according to Tertullian's account, they believed that the Father was so intimately united with the man Christ, his Son, that he suffered with him the anguish of an afflicted life, and the torments of an ignominious death. However ready many may have been to embrace this erroneous doctrine, it does not appear that this sect formed themselves a separate place of worship, or removed themselves from the ordinary assemblies of Christians. An opinion highly resembling that now mentioned was, about the same time, professed at Rome by Theodotus, who, though a tanner, was a man of profound learning, and also by Artemas, or Artemon, from whom the sect of the Artemonites derived their origin. The accounts given of these two persons, by the ancient writers, are not only few in number, but are also extremely ambiguous and obscure. Their sentiments, however, as far as they can be collected from the best records, amount to this, that, at the birth of the man Christ, a certain divine energy, or portion of the divine nature, and not the person of the Father, as Praxeas imagined, united itself to him. It is impossible to decide with any degree of certainty which of the two was the most ancient, Theodotus, or Artemon, as also whether they both taught the same doctrine, or differed in their opinions. One thing, indeed, is certain, and that is, that the disciples of both applied the dictates of philosophy, and even the science of geometry, to the explication of the Christian doctrine. A like attachment to the dictates of a presumptuous philosophy, induced Hermogenes, a painter by profession, to abandon the doctrine of Christianity concerning the origin of the world and the nature of the soul, and thus to raise new troubles in the Church. Regarding matter as the fountain of all evil, he could not persuade himself that God had created it from nothing, by an almighty act of his will, and therefore he maintained, that the world, with whatever it contains, as also the souls of men, and other spirits, were formed by the deity from an uncreated and eternal mass of corrupt matter. In this doctrine there were many intricate things, and it manifestly jarred with the opinions commonly received among Christians relative to that difficult and almost unsearchable subject. How Hermogenes explained those doctrines of Christianity, which opposed his system, neither Tertullian, who refuted it, nor any of the ancient writers inform us. These sects, which we have now been passing in review, may be justly regarded as the offspring of philosophy. But they were succeeded by one in which ignorance reigned, and which was the mortal enemy of philosophy and letters. It was formed by Montanus, an obscure man, without any capacity or strength of judgment, and who lived in a Phrygian village called Pepuza. This weak man was foolish and extravagant enough to take it into his head, that he was the Paraclete, or Comforter, which the divine Saviour, at his departure from the earth, promised to send to his disciples to lead them to all truth. He made no attempts upon the peculiar doctrines of Christianity, but only declared, that he was sent with a divine commission, to give to the moral precepts delivered by Christ and his apostles the finishing touch that was to bring them to perfection. He was of opinion, that Christ and his apostles made, in their precepts, many allowances to the infirmities of those among whom they lived, and that this condescending indulgence rendered their system of moral laws imperfect and incomplete. He therefore added to the laws of the gospel many austere decisions, inculcated the necessity of multiplying fasts, prohibited second marriages as unlawful, maintained that the Church should refuse absolution to those who had fallen into the commission of enormous sins, and condemned all care of the body, especially all nicety in dress, and all female ornaments. The excessive austerity of this ignorant fanatic did not stop here. He showed the same aversion to the noblest employments of the mind, that he did to the innocent enjoyments of life, and gave it as his opinion, that philosophy, arts, and whatever savored of polite literature, should be mercilessly banished from the Christian Church. He looked upon those Christians as guilty of a most heinous transgression, who saved their lives by flight, from the persecuting sword, or who ransomed them, by money, from the hands of their cruel and mercenary judges. I might mention many other precepts of the same teacher, equally to these in severity and rigor. It was impossible to suffer, within the bounds of the Church, an enthusiast, who gave himself out for a teacher, whose precepts were superior in sanctity to those of Christ himself, and who imposed his austere discipline upon Christians, as enjoined, by a divine authority, and dictated by the oracle of celestial wisdom, which spoke to the world through him. Beside, his dismal predictions concerning the disasters that were to happen in the empire, and the approaching destruction of the Roman Republic, were every way proper to render him obnoxious to the governing powers, and also to excite their resentment against the Church, which nourished such an inauspicious prophet in its bosom. Montanus, therefore, first by a decree of certain assemblies, and afterward by the unanimous voice of the whole Church, was solemnly separated from the body of the faithful. It is, however, certain, that the very severity of his doctrines gained him the esteem and confidence of many, who were far from being of the lowest order. The most eminent among these were Priscilla and Maximilla, ladies more remarkable for their opulence than for their virtue, and who fell with a high degree of warmth and zeal into the visions of their fanatical chief, prophesied like him, and imitated the pretended Paraclete in all the variety of his extravagance and folly. Hence it became an easy matter for Montanus to erect a new church, which was also, in effect, first established at Pepuza, a town in Phrygia, and afterwards spread abroad through Asia, Africa, and a part of Europe. The most eminent and learned of all the followers of this rigid enthusiast was Tertullian, a man of great learning and genius, but of an austere and melancholy natural temper. This great man, by adopting the sentiments of Montanus, and maintaining his cause with fortitude, and even vehemence, in a multitude of books written upon that occasion, has shown to the world a mortifying spectacle of the deviations of which human nature is capable, even in those in whom it seems to have approached the nearest to perfection. The 3rd Century Part 2. The External History of the Church Chapter 1, which contains the prosperous events that happened to the Church during this century that the Christians suffered, in this century, calamities and injuries of the most dreadful kind, is a matter that admits of no debate, nor was there, indeed, any period in which they were not exposed to perpetual dangers. For not to mention the fury of the people, set in motion, so often, by the craft and zeal of their licentious priests, the evil came from a higher source. The praetors and magistrates, notwithstanding the ancient laws of the emperors in favor of the Christians, had it in their power to pursue them with all sorts of vexations, as often as avarice, cruelty, or superstition roused up the infernal spirit of persecution in their breasts. At the same time, it is certain, that the rights and privileges of the Christians were multiplied, in this century, much more than many are apt to imagine. In the army, at court, and indeed, in all the orders of the nation, there was a considerable number of Christians, who lived entirely unmolested, and, what is still more, the profession of Christianity was no obstacle to public preferment under most of the emperors that reigned in this century. It is also certain, that the Christians had, in many places, houses where they assembled for the purposes of divine worship, and that with the knowledge and connivance of the emperors and magistrates. And though it be more than probable, that this liberty was, upon many occasions, and even for the most part, purchased at a high rate, yet it is manifest, that some of the emperors were very favorably inclined toward the Christians, and were far from having an aversion to their religion. Caracalla, the son of Severus, was proclaimed emperor in the year 211, and during the 6 years of his government, he neither oppressed the Christians himself, nor permitted any others to treat them with cruelty or injustice. Heliogabalus also, though in other respects the most infamous of all princes, and perhaps the most odious of all mortals, showed no marks of bitterness or aversion to the disciples of Jesus. His successor Alexander Severus, who was a prince distinguished by a noble assemblage of the most excellent and illustrious virtues, did not, indeed, abrogate the laws that had been enacted against the Christians, and this is the reason why we have some examples of martyrdom under his administration. It is nevertheless certain, that he showed them, in many ways, and upon every occasion that was offered him, the most undoubted marks of benignity and favor. Nay, he is said to have gone so far as to pay a certain sort of worship to the divine author of our religion. This his favorable inclination toward the Christians was probably owing, at first, to the instructions and counsels of his mother Julia Mammia, for whom he had a high degree of love and veneration. Julia had very favorable sentiments of the Christian religion, and, being once at Antioch, sent for the famous Origen from Alexandria, in order to enjoy the pleasure and advantage of his conversation and instructions. Those who assert that Julia, and her son Alexander, embraced the Christian religion, are by no means furnished with unexceptionable testimonies to confirm this fact, though we may affirm, with confidence, that this virtuous prince looked upon Christianity as meriting, beyond all other institutions, countenance and favor from the state, and considered its author as worthy of a place among those who have been distinguished by their sublime virtues, and honored with a commission from above. Under Gordian the Christians lived in tranquillity. His successors the Philips, father and son, proved so favorable and even friendly to them, that these two emperors passed, in the opinion of many, for Christians, and, indeed, the arguments alleged to prove that they embraced, though in a secret and clandestine manner, the religion of Jesus, seem to have a high degree of weight, and render this fact extremely probable. But as these arguments are opposed by others equally specious, that famous question, relating to the religion of Philip the Arabian, and his son, must be left undecided. Neither side offer reasons so victorious and unanswerable, as to produce a full and complete conviction, and this is therefore one of those many cases, where a suspension of judgment is both allowable and wise. With respect to Gallienus, and some other emperors of this century, if they did not professedly favor the progress of Christianity, yet neither did they oppress its followers, nor retard its advancement. This clemency and benevolence, which the followers of Jesus experienced from great men, and especially from those of imperial dignity, must be placed, without doubt, among those human means that contributed to multiply the number of Christians, and to enlarge the bounds of the Church. Other causes, however, both divine and human, must be added here, to render a complete and satisfactory account of this matter. Among the causes which belong to the first of these classes, we do not only reckon the intrinsic force of celestial truth, and the piety and fortitude of those who declared it to the world, but also that especial and interposing providence, which, by dreams and visions, presented to the minds of many, who were either inattentive to the Christian doctrine, or its professed enemies, touched their hearts with a conviction of the truth, and a sense of its importance, and engaged them, without delay, to profess themselves the disciples of Christ. To this may also be added, the healing of diseases, and other miracles, which many Christians were yet enabled to perform by invoking the name of the divine Saviour. The number of miracles was, however, much less in this than the preceding century, nor must this alteration be attributed only to the divine wisdom, which rendered miraculous interpositions less frequent in proportion as they became less necessary, but also to his justice, which was provoked to diminish the frequency of gifts, which some did not scruple to pervert to mercenary purposes. If we turn our view to the human means that contributed, at this time, to multiply the numbers of Christians, and to extend the limits of the Church, we shall find a great variety of causes uniting their influence, and contributing jointly to this happy purpose. Among these must be reckoned the translations of the sacred writings into various languages, the zeal and labors of Origen in spreading abroad copies of them everywhere, and the different works that were published, by learned and pious men, in defense of the gospel. We may add also to this, that the acts of beneficence and liberality, performed by the Christians, even toward those whose religious principles they abhorred, had a great influence in attracting the esteem, and removing the prejudices of many, who were thus prepared for examining, with candor, the Christian doctrine, and consequently, for receiving its divine light. The worshippers of the pagan deities must have been destitute of every generous affection, of every humane feeling, if the view of that boundless charity, which the Christians exercised toward the poor, the love they expressed even to their enemies, the tender care they took of the sick and infirm, the humanity they discovered in the redemption of captives, and the other illustrious virtues, which rendered them so worthy of universal esteem, had not touched their hearts, dispelled their prepossessions, and rendered them more favorable to the disciples of Jesus. If, among the causes of the propagation of Christianity, there is any place due to pious frauds, it is certain, that they merit a very small part of the honor of having contributed to this glorious purpose, since they were practiced by few, and that very seldom. That the limits of the Church were extended in this century, is a matter beyond all controversy. It is not, however, equally certain in what manner, by what persons, or in what parts of the world, this was effected. Origen, invited from Alexandria by an Arabian prince, converted, by his assiduous labors, a certain tribe of wandering Arabs to the Christian faith. The Goths, a fierce and warlike people, who inhabited the countries of Mysia and Thrace, and who, accustomed to rapine, vexed the neighboring provinces by perpetual incursions, received the knowledge of the gospel by the means of certain Christian doctors sent thither from Asia. The holy lives of these venerable teachers, and the miraculous powers with which they were endowed, attracted the esteem, even of a people educated to nothing but plunder and devastation, and absolutely uncivilized by letters or science, and their authority and influence grew so great, and produced, in process of time, such remarkable effects, that a great part of this barbarous people became the disciples of Christ, and put off, in a manner, that ferocity that was become so natural to them. The Christian assemblies, founded in Gaul by the Asiatic doctors in the preceding century, were few in number, and of very little extent, but both their number and their extent were considerably increased from the time of the Emperor Decius. Under his reign Dionysius, Gatian, Trophimus, Paul, Saturninus, Martial, Stramonius, men of exemplary piety, passed into this province, and amidst dangers and trials of various kinds, erected churches at Paris, Tours, Arles, and several other places. This was followed by a rapid progress of the gospel among the Gauls, as the disciples of these pious teachers spread, in a short time, the knowledge of Christianity through the whole country. We must also place in this century the origin of several German churches, such as those of Cologne, Treves, Metz, and others, of which Eucharius, Valerius, Maternus, and Clemens, were the principal founders. The historians of Scotland inform us, that the light of Christianity arose upon that country during this century, but, though there be nothing improbable in this assertion, yet it is not built upon incontestable authority. Chapter 2. Concerning the calamitous events which happened to the Church in this century, by the beginning of this century, the Christian Church had suffered calamities of various kinds throughout the provinces of the Roman Empire. These sufferings increased in a terrible manner, in consequence of a law made, in the year 203, by the Emperor Severus, who, in other respects, was certainly no enemy to the Christians, by which every subject of the empire was prohibited to change the religion of his ancestors for that of the Christian or Jewish. This law was, in its effects, most prejudicial to the Christians, for, though it did not formally condemn them, and seemed only adapted to put a stop to the further progress of the gospel, yet it induced rapacious and unjust magistrates to persecute even unto death the poorer sort among the Christians, that thus the richer might be led, through fear of like treatment, to purchase their tranquility and safety at an expensive rate. Hence many of the disciples of Christ, both in Egypt, and also in several parts of Asia and Africa, were put to death in consequence of this law. Among these Leonidas, the father of Origen, Perpetua and Felicitas, those two famous African ladies, whose acts are come down to our times, Potamina, Marcella, and other martyrs of both sexes, acquired an illustrious name by the magnanimity and tranquility with which they endured the most cruel sufferings. From the death of Severus to the reign of Maximin, the condition of the Christians was, in some places, prosperous, and in all, supportable. But with Maximin the face of affairs changed. This unworthy emperor, having animated the Roman soldiers to assassinate Alexander Severus, dreaded the resentment of the Christians, whom that excellent prince had favored and protected in a distinguished manner, and for this reason, he ordered the bishops, whom he knew that Alexander had always treated as his intimate friends, to be seized and put to death. During his reign, the Christians suffered in the most barbarous manner, for, though the edict of this tyrant extended only to the bishops and leaders of the Christian Church, yet its shocking effects reached much further, as it animated the heathen priests, the magistrates, and the multitude, against Christians of every rank and order. This storm was succeeded by a calm, in which the Christians enjoyed a happy tranquility for many years. The accession of Decius Trajan to the imperial throne, in the year 249, raised a new tempest, in which the fury of persecution fell in a dreadful manner upon the Church of Christ. For this emperor, either from an ill-grounded fear of the Christians, or from a violent zeal for the superstition of his ancestors, published most terrible and cruel edicts, by which the praetors were ordered, upon pain of death, either to extirpate the whole body of Christians without exception, or to force them, by torments of various kinds, to return to the pagan worship. Hence, in all the provinces of the empire, multitudes of Christians were, during the space of 2 years, put to death by the most horrid punishments, which an ingenious barbarity could invent. The most unhappy circumstance of all these cruelties was, their fatal influence upon the faith and constancy of many of the sufferers, for as this persecution was much more terrible than all those that preceded it, so a great number of Christians, dismayed, not at the approach of death, but at the aspect of those dreadful and lingering torments, which a barbarous magistracy had prepared to combat their constancy, fell from the profession of their faith, and secured themselves from punishment. Either by offering sacrifices, or by burning incense, before the images of the gods, or by purchasing certificates from the pagan priests. Hence arose the opprobrious names of sacrificati, given to those who sacrificed, thurificati, to those who burned incense, and libellatici, to those who produced certificates. This defection of such a prodigious number of Christians under Decius was the occasion of great commotions in the Church, and produced debates of a very difficult and delicate nature. For the lapsed, or those that had fallen from their Christian profession, were desirous to be restored to church communion, without submitting to that painful course of penitential discipline, which the ecclesiastical laws indispensably required. The bishops were divided upon this matter, some were for showing the desired indulgence, while others opposed it with all their might. In Egypt and Africa, many, in order to obtain more speedily the pardon of their apostasy, interested the martyrs in their behalf, and received from them letters of reconciliation and peace, i.e., a formal act by which they, the martyrs, declared, in their last moments, that they looked upon them as worthy of their communion, and desired of consequence that they should be restored to their place among the brethren. Some bishops and presbyters readmitted into the Church with too much facility, apostates and transgressors, who produced such testimonies as these. But Cyprian, Bishop of Carthage, a man of severe wisdom and great dignity of character, acted in quite another way. Though he had no intention to derogate from the authority of the venerable martyrs, yet he opposed with vigor this unreasonable lenity, and set limits to the efficacy of these letters of reconciliation and peace. Hence arose a keen dispute between him and the martyrs, confessors, presbyters, and lapsed, seconded by the people, and yet, notwithstanding this formidable multitude of adversaries, the venerable bishop came off victorious. Gallus, the successor of Decius, and Volusianus, son of the former, reanimated the flame of persecution, which was beginning to burn with less fury. And, beside the sufferings which the Christians had to undergo in consequence of their cruel edicts, they were also involved in the public calamities that prevailed at this time, and suffered grievously from a terrible pestilence, which spread desolation through many provinces of the empire. This pestilence also was an occasion which the pagan priests used with dexterity to renew the rage of persecution against them, by persuading the people that it was on account of the lenity used toward the Christians, that the gods sent down their judgments upon the nations. In the year 254, Valerian being declared emperor, made the fury of persecution cease, and restored the church to a state of tranquility. The clemency and benevolence which Valerian showed to the Christians, continued until the 5th year of his reign. Then the scene began to change, and the change indeed was sudden. Macrianus, a superstitious and cruel bigot to paganism, had gained an entire ascendant over Valerian, and was his chief counselor in everything that related to the administration of the government. By the persuasion of this imperious minister, the Christians were prohibited to assemble themselves together, and their bishops and doctors were sent into banishment. This edict was published in the year 257, and was followed, the year after, by one still more severe, in consequence of which a considerable number of Christians, in all the different provinces of the empire, were put to death, and that by such cruel methods of execution, as were much more terrible than death itself. Of those that suffered in this persecution, the most eminent were Cyprian, bishop of Carthage, Sixtus, bishop of Rome, and Laurentius, a Roman deacon, who was barbarously consumed by a slow and lingering fire. An unexpected event suspended, for a while, the sufferings of the Christians. Valerian was made prisoner in the war against the Persians, and his son Gallienus, in the year 260, restored peace to the church. The condition of the Christians was rather supportable than happy, under the reign of Gallienus, which lasted 8 years, as also under the short administration of his successor Claudius. Nor did they suffer much during the first 4 years of the reign of Aurelian, who was raised to the empire in the year 270. But the 5th year of this emperor's administration would have proved fatal to them, had not his violent death prevented the execution of his cruel purposes. For while, set on by the unjust suggestions of his own superstition, or by the barbarous counsels of a bigoted priesthood, he was preparing a formidable attack upon the Christians, he was obliged to march into Gaul, where he was murdered, in the year 275, before his edicts were published throughout the empire. Few therefore suffered martyrdom under his reign, and indeed, during the remainder of this century, the Christians enjoyed a considerable measure of ease and tranquility. They were, at least, free from any violent attacks of oppression and injustice, except in a small number of cases, where the avarice and superstition of the Roman magistrates interrupted their tranquility. While the Roman emperors and proconsuls employed against the Christians the terror of unrighteous edicts, and the edge of the destroying sword, the Platonic philosophers, who have been described above, exhausted against Christianity all the force of their learning and eloquence, and all the resources of their art and dexterity, in rhetorical declamations, subtle writings, and ingenious stratagems. These artful adversaries were so much the more dangerous and formidable, as they had adopted several of the doctrines and institutions of the gospel and with a specious air of moderation and impartiality, were attempting, after the example of their master Ammonius, to reconcile paganism with Christianity, and to form a sort of coalition of the ancient and the new religion. These philosophers had at their head, in this century, Porphyry, a Syrian, or, as some allege, a Tyrian, by birth, who wrote against the Christians a long and laborious work, which was destroyed afterward by an imperial edict. He was, undoubtedly, a writer of great dexterity, genius, and erudition, as those of his works that yet remain sufficiently testify. But those very works, and the history of his life, show us, at the same time, that he was a much more virulent, than a formidable enemy to the Christians. For by them it appears, that he was much more attentive to the suggestions of a superstitious spirit and the visions of a lively fancy, than to the sober dictates of right reason and a sound judgment. And it may be more especially observed of the fragments that yet remain of his work against the Christians, that they are equally destitute of judgment and equity, and are utterly unworthy of a wise and a good man. Many were the deceitful and perfidious stratagems by which this sect endeavored to obscure the luster, and to diminish the authority of the Christian doctrine. But none of these were more dangerous than the seducing artifice with which they formed a comparison between the life, actions, and miracles of Christ, and the history of the ancient philosophers, and placed the contending parties in such fallacious points of view, as to make the pretended sages of antiquity appear in nothing inferior to the divine Saviour. With this view, Archytas of Tarentum, Pythagoras, of whom Porphyry wrote the life, Apollonius Tyaneus, a Pythagorean philosopher, whose miracles and peregrinations were highly celebrated by the vulgar, were brought upon the scene, and exhibited as divine teachers and rivals of the glory of the Son of God. Philostratus, one of the most eminent rhetoricians of this age, composed a pompous history of the life of Apollonius, who was little else than a cunning knave, and did nothing but ape the austerity and sanctity of Pythagoras. This history appears manifestly designed to draw a parallel between Christ and the philosopher of Tyana, but the impudent fictions, and the ridiculous fables, with which this work is filled, must, one would think, have rendered it incapable of deceiving any who were possessed of a sound mind, any, but such as, through the corruption of vicious prejudices were willing to be deceived. But as there are no opinions, however absurd, and no stories, however idle and improbable, that a weak and ignorant multitude, who are more attentive to the pomp of words than to the truth of things, will not easily swallow, so it happened, that many were ensnared by the absurd attempts of these insidious philosophers. Some were induced by these perfidious stratagems to abandon the Christian religion, which they had embraced. Others, when they heard that true Christianity, as it was taught by Jesus, and not as it was afterward corrupted by his disciples, differed almost in nothing from the pagan religion properly explained and restored to its primitive purity, determined to remain in the religion of their ancestors, and in the worship of their gods. A third sort were led, by these comparisons between Christ and the ancient philosophers, to form to themselves a motley system of religion composed of the tenets of both parties, whom they treated with the same veneration and respect. Such was, particularly, the method of Alexander Severus, who paid indiscriminately divine honors to Christ, and to Orpheus, to Apollonius, and the other philosophers and heroes whose names were famous in ancient times. The credit and power of the Jews were now too much diminished to render them as capable of injuring the Christians, by their influence upon the magistrates, as they had formerly been. This did not, however, discourage their malicious efforts, as the books which Tertullian and Cyprian have written against them abundantly show, with several other writings of the Christian doctors, who complained of the malignity of the Jews, and of their perfidious stratagems. During the persecution under Severus, a certain person called Domninus, who had embraced Christianity, deserted to the Jews, doubtless, to avoid the punishments that were decreed against the Christians, and it was to recall this apostate to his duty and his profession, that Serapion, bishop of Antioch, wrote a particular treatise against the Jews. We may, however, conclude from this instance, that when the Christians were persecuted, the Jews were treated with less severity and contempt, on account of their enmity against the disciples of Jesus. And from the same fact we may also learn, that though they were in a state of great subjection and abasement, yet they were not entirely deprived of all power of oppressing the Christians. Part 2 Internal History of the Church Chapter 1 Concerning the state of letters and philosophy during this century. The arts and sciences, which in the preceding century, were in a declining state, seemed in this ready to expire, and had now lost all their vigor, and all their luster. The celebrated rhetorician Longinus, and the eminent historian Dion Cassius, with a few others, were the last among the Greeks, who stood in the breach against the prevailing ignorance and barbarism of the times. Men of learning and genius were less numerous still in the western provinces of the empire, though there were, in several places, flourishing schools erected for the advancement of the sciences, and the culture of taste and genius. Different reasons contributed to this decay of learning. Few of the emperors patronized the sciences, or encouraged, by the prospect of their favor and protection, that emulation, which is the soul of the Republic of Letters. Beside, the civil wars that almost always distracted the empire, were extremely unfavorable to the pursuit of science, and the perpetual incursions of the barbarous nations interrupted that leisure and tranquility which are so essential to the progress of learning and knowledge, and extinguished, among a people accustomed to nothing almost but the din of arms, all desire of literary acquisitions. If we turn our eyes toward the state of philosophy, the prospect will appear somewhat less desolate and comfortless. There were, as yet, in several of the Grecian sects, men of considerable knowledge and reputation, of whom Longinus has mentioned the greatest part. But all these sects were gradually eclipsed by the school of Ammonius, whose origin and doctrines have been considered above. This victorious sect, which was formed in Egypt, issued forth from thence with such a rapid progress, that, in a short time, it extended itself almost throughout the Roman Empire, and drew into its vortex the greatest part of those who applied themselves, through inclination, to the study of philosophy. This amazing progress was due to Plotinus, the most eminent disciple of Ammonius, a man of a most subtle invention, and endowed by nature with a genius capable of the most profound researches, and equal to the investigation of the most abstruse and difficult subjects. This penetrating and sublime philosopher taught publicly first in Persia, and afterward at Rome, and in Campania, in all which places the youth flocked in crowds to receive his instruction. He comprehended the precepts of his philosophy in several books, the most of which are yet extant. The number of disciples that were formed in the school of Plotinus is almost beyond credibility. The most famous of them was Porphyry, who spread abroad through Sicily and many other countries the doctrine of his master, revised with great accuracy, adorned with the graces of a flowing and elegant style, and enriched with new inventions and curious improvements. From the time of Ammonius, until the 6th century, this was almost the only system of philosophy that was publicly taught at Alexandria. A certain philosopher, whose name was Plutarch, having learned it there, brought it into Greece, and renewed, at Athens, the celebrated academy, from whence issued a set of illustrious philosophers, whom we shall have occasion to mention in the progress of this work. We have unfolded above the nature and doctrines of this philosophy, as far as was compatible with the brevity of our present design. It is, however, proper to add here, that its votaries were not all of the same sentiments, but thought very differently upon a variety of subjects. This difference of opinion was the natural consequence of that fundamental law, which the whole sect was obliged to keep constantly in view, viz. That truth was to be pursued with the utmost liberty, and to be collected from all the different systems in which it lay dispersed. Hence it happened, that the Athenians rejected certain opinions that were entertained by the philosophers of Alexandria. None, however, who were ambitious to be ranked among these new Platonists, called in question the main doctrines, which formed the groundwork of their singular system, those, for example, which regarded the existence of one God, the fountain of all things, the eternity of the world, the dependence of matter upon the Supreme Being, the nature of souls, the plurality of gods, the method of interpreting the popular superstitions, etc. The famous question concerning the excellence and utility of human learning, was now debated with great warmth among the Christians, and the contending parties, in this controversy, seemed hitherto of equal force in point of numbers, or nearly so. Many recommended the study of philosophy, and an acquaintance with the Greek and Roman literature, while others maintained that these were pernicious to the interests of genuine Christianity, and the progress of true piety. The cause of letters and philosophy triumphed, however, by degrees, and those who wished well to them, gained ground more and more, till at length the superiority was manifestly decided in their favor. This victory was principally due to the influence and authority of Origen, who having been early instructed in the new kind of Platonism already mentioned, blended it unhappily with the purer and more sublime tenets of a celestial doctrine, and recommended it, in the warmest manner, to the youth who attended his public lessons. The fame of this philosopher increased daily among the Christians, and, in proportion to his rising credit, his method of proposing and explaining the doctrines of Christianity gained authority, till it became almost universal. Beside, some of the disciples of Plotinus having embraced Christianity, on condition that they should be allowed to retain such of the opinions of their master as they thought of superior excellence and merit, this must also have contributed, in some measure, to turn the balance in favor of the sciences. These Christian philosophers preserving still a fervent zeal for the doctrines of their heathen chief, would naturally embrace every opportunity of spreading them abroad, and instilling them into the minds of the ignorant and the unwary. Chapter 2 concerning the doctors and ministers of the Church, and its form of government, during this century. The form of ecclesiastical government that had been adopted by Christians in general, had now acquired greater degrees of stability and force, both in particular churches, and in the universal society of Christians collectively considered. It appears incontestable from the most authentic records, and the best histories of this century, that, in the larger cities, there was, at the head of each church, a person to whom was given the title of bishop, who ruled this sacred community with a certain sort of authority, in concert, however, with the body of presbyters, and consulting, in matters of moment, the opinion and the voices of the whole assembly. It is also equally evident, that in every province, one bishop was invested with a certain superiority over the rest, in point of rank and authority. This was necessary to the maintenance of that association of churches that had been introduced in the preceding century, and contributed, moreover, to facilitate the holding of general councils, and to give a certain degree of order and consistence to their proceedings. It must, at the same time, be carefully observed, that the rights and privileges of these primitive bishops, were not, everywhere, accurately fixed, nor determined in such a manner as to prevent encroachments and disputes, nor does it appear, that the chief authority of the province, was always conferred upon that bishop who presided over the church established in the metropolis. It is further to be noticed, as a matter beyond all dispute, that the bishops of Rome, Antioch, and Alexandria, considered as rulers of primitive and apostolic churches, had a kind of preeminence over all others, and were not only consulted frequently in affairs of a difficult and momentous nature, but were also distinguished by peculiar rights and privileges. With respect, particularly, to the Bishop of Rome, he is supposed by Cyprian to have had, at this time, a certain preeminence in the Church, nor does he stand alone in this opinion. But it is to be carefully observed, that even those who, with Cyprian, attributed this preeminence to the Roman prelate, insisted, at the same time, with the utmost warmth, upon the equality, in point of dignity and authority, that subsisted among all the members of the episcopal order. In consequence of this opinion of an equality among all Christian bishops, they rejected, with contempt, the judgment of the Bishop of Rome, when they thought it ill-founded or unjust, and followed their own sense of things, with a perfect independence. Of this Cyprian himself gave an eminent example, in his famous controversy with Stephen Bishop of Rome, concerning the baptism of heretics, in which he treated the arrogance of that imperious prelate with a noble indignation, and also with a perfect contempt. Whoever, therefore, compares all these things together, will easily perceive, that the preeminence of the Bishop of Rome, was a preeminence of order and association, and not of power and authority. Or, to explain the matter yet more clearly, the preeminence of the Bishop of Rome, in the universal Church, was such as that of Cyprian, Bishop of Carthage, was in the African churches. And every one knows, that the precedence of this latter prelate diminished in nothing the equality that subsisted among all the African bishops, invalidated in no instance their rights and liberties, but gave only to Cyprian, as the president of their general assemblies, a power of calling councils, of presiding in them, of admonishing his brethren in a mild and fraternal manner, and of executing, in their name, such offices as the order and purposes of these ecclesiastical meetings necessarily required. The face of things began now to change in the Christian Church. The ancient method of ecclesiastical government seemed, in general, still to subsist, while, at the same time, by imperceptible steps, it varied from the primitive rule, and degenerated toward the form of a religious monarchy. For the bishops aspired to higher degrees of power and authority than they had formerly possessed, and not only violated the rights of the people, but also made gradual encroachments upon the privileges of the presbyters. And that they might cover these usurpations with an air of justice, and an appearance of reason, they published new doctrines concerning the nature of the Church, and of the episcopal dignity, which, however, were in general so obscure, that they themselves seem to have understood them as little as those to whom they were delivered. One of the principal authors of this change in the government of the Church, was Cyprian, who pleaded for the power of the bishops with more zeal and vehemence than had ever been hitherto employed in that cause, though not with an unshaken constancy and perseverance, for, in difficult and perilous times, necessity sometimes obliged him to yield, and to submit several things to the judgment and authority of the Church. This change, in the form of ecclesiastical government, was soon followed by a train of vices, which dishonored the character and authority of those to whom the administration of the Church was committed. For, though several yet continued to exhibit to the world illustrious examples of primitive piety and Christian virtue, yet many were sunk in luxury and voluptuousness, puffed up with vanity, arrogance, and ambition, possessed with a spirit of contention and discord, and addicted to many other vices that cast an undeserved reproach upon the holy profession of which they were unworthy members. This is testified in the most ample manner, by the repeated complaints of many of the most respectable writers of this century, that the truth will not permit us to spread the veil, which we should otherwise be desirous to cast over such enormities among an order so sacred. The bishops assumed, in many places, a princely authority, particularly those who had the greatest number of churches under their inspection, and who presided over the most opulent assemblies. They appropriated to their evangelical function the splendid ensigns of temporal majesty. A throne, surrounded with ministers, exalted above his equals the servant of the meek and humble Jesus, and sumptuous garments dazzled the eyes and the minds of the multitude into an ignorant veneration for their arrogated authority. The example of the bishops was ambitiously imitated by the presbyters, who, neglecting the sacred duties of their station, abandoned themselves to the indolence and delicacy of an effeminate and luxurious life. The deacons, beholding the presbyters deserting thus their functions, boldly usurped their rights and privileges, and the effects of a corrupt ambition were spread through every rank of the sacred order. From what has been now observed, we may come, perhaps, at the true origin of minor or lesser orders, which were, in this century, added everywhere to those of the bishops, presbyters, and deacons. For certainly, the titles and offices of subdeacons, acolythi, ostiarii, or doorkeepers, readers, exorcists, and copiati, would never have been heard of in the Church, if its rulers had been assiduously and zealously employed in promoting the interests of truth and piety by their labors and their example. But when the honors and privileges of the bishops and presbyters were augmented, the deacons also began to extend their ambitious views, and to despise those lower functions and employments which they had hitherto exercised with such humility and zeal. The additional orders that were now created to diminish the labors of the present rulers of the Church, had functions allotted to them, which their names partly explain. The institution of exorcists was a consequence of the doctrine of the New Platonists, which the Christians adopted, and which taught that the evil genii, or spirits, were continually hovering over human bodies, toward which they were carried by a natural and vehement desire, and that vicious men were not so much impelled to sin by an innate depravity, or by the seduction of example, as by the internal suggestions of some evil demon. The copiati were employed in providing for the decent interment of the dead. Marriage was permitted to all the various ranks and orders of the clergy, high and low. Those, however, who continued in a state of celibacy, obtained by this abstinence a higher reputation of sanctity and virtue than others. This was owing to an almost general persuasion, that they, who took wives, were of all others the most subject to the influence of malignant demons. And as it was of infinite importance to the interests of the Church, that no impure or malevolent spirit entered into the bodies of such as were appointed to govern or to instruct others, so the people were desirous that the clergy should use their utmost efforts to abstain from the pleasures of the conjugal life. Many of the sacred order, especially in Africa, consented to satisfy the desires of the people, and endeavored to do this in such a manner as not to offer an entire violence to their own inclinations. For this purpose, they formed connections with those women who had made vows of perpetual chastity, and it was an ordinary thing for an ecclesiastic to admit one of these fair saints to the participation of his bed, but still under the most solemn declarations, that nothing passed in this commerce that was contrary to the rules of chastity and virtue. These holy concubines were called by the Greeks, sine sactoi, and by the Latins, muliers sub introducti. This indecent custom alarmed the zeal of the more pious among the bishops, who employed the utmost efforts of their severity and vigilance to abolish it, though it was a long time before they entirely effected this laudable purpose. Thus we have given a short, though not a very pleasing view of the rulers of the Church during this century, and should now mention the principal writers that distinguished themselves in it by their learned and pious productions. The most eminent of these, whether we consider the extent of his fame or the multiplicity of his labors, was Origen, presbyter and catechist of Alexandria, a a man of vast and uncommon abilities, and the greatest luminary of the Christian world that this age exhibited to view. Had the justness of his judgment been equal to the immensity of his genius, the fervor of his piety, his indefatigable patience, his extensive erudition, and his other eminent and superior talents, all encomiums must have fallen short of his merit. Yet such as he was, his virtues and his labors deserve the admiration of all ages, and his name will be transmitted with honor through the annals of time as long as learning and genius shall be esteemed among men. The second in renown among the writers of this century, was Julius Africanus, a native of Palestine, a man of the most profound erudition, but the greatest part of whose learned labors are unhappily lost. Hippolytus, whose history is much involved in darkness, is also esteemed among the most celebrated authors and martyrs of this age, but those writings, which at present bear his name, are justly looked upon by many as either extremely corrupted, or entirely spurious. Gregory, Bishop of New Caesarea, acquired, at this time, the title of Thaumaturgus, i.e. wonderworker, on account of the variety of great and signal miracles, which he is said to have wrought during the course of his ministry. Few of his works have come down to our times, and his miracles are called in question by many, as unsupported by sufficient evidence. It were to be wished that we had more of the writings of Dionysius, Bishop of Alexandria, than those which have survived the ruins of time, since the few remaining fragments of his works discover the most consummate wisdom and prudence, and the most amiable spirit of moderation and candor, and thus abundantly vindicate, from all suspicion of flattery, the ancients who mentioned him under the title of Dionysius the Great. Methodius appears to have been a man of great piety, and highly respectable on account of his eminent virtue, but those of his works which are yet extant, discover no great degree of penetration and acuteness in handling controversy and weighing opinions. Cyprian, Bishop of Carthage, a man of the most eminent abilities and flowing eloquence, stands foremost in the list of Latin writers. His letters, and indeed the most of his works, breathe such a noble and pathetic spirit of piety, that it is impossible to read them without the warmest feelings of enthusiasm. We must however observe, that he would have been a better writer, had he been less attentive to the ornaments of rhetoric, and a better bishop, had he been able to restrain the vehemence of his temper, and to distinguish, with more acuteness, between truth and falsehood. The dialogue of Minucius Felix, which bears the title of Octavius, effaces with such judgment, spirit, and force, the calumnies and reproaches that were cast upon the Christians by their adversaries, that it deserves an attentive perusal from those who are desirous to know the state of the Church during this century. The 7 books of Arnobius, the African, written against the Gentiles, are a still more copious and ample defense of the Christians, and though obscure in several places, may yet be read with pleasure and with profit. It is true, that this rhetorician, too little instructed in the Christian religion when he wrote this work, has mingled great errors with solemn and important truths, and has exhibited Christianity under a certain philosophical form, very different from that in which it is commonly received. We refer our readers, for an account of the authors of inferior note, who lived in this century, to those who have professedly given histories or enumerations of the Christian writers. Chapter 3. Concerning the doctrine of the Christian Church in this century, the best doctrines of Christianity were now explained to the people in their native purity and simplicity, without any mixture of abstract reasonings or subtle inventions, nor were the feeble minds of the multitude loaded with a great variety of precepts. But the Christian doctors, who had applied themselves to the study of letters and philosophy, soon abandoned the frequented paths, and struck out into the devious wilds of fancy. The Egyptians distinguished themselves in this new method of explaining the truth. They looked upon it as a noble and a glorious task to bring the doctrines of celestial wisdom into a certain subjection to the precepts of their philosophy, and to make deep and profound researches into the intimate and hidden nature of those truths which the divine Saviour had delivered to his disciples. Origen was at the head of this speculative tribe. This great man, enchanted by the charms of the Platonic philosophy, set it up as the test of all religion, and imagined that the reasons of each doctrine were to be found in that favorite philosophy, and their nature and extent to be determined by it. It must be confessed, that he handled this matter with modesty and with caution, but he still gave an example to his disciples, the abuse of which could not fail to be pernicious, and under the authority of which they would naturally indulge themselves without restraint in every wanton fancy. And so, indeed, the case was, for the disciples of Origen, breaking forth from the limits fixed by their master, interpreted, in the most licentious manner, the divine truths of religion according to the tenor of the Platonic philosophy. From these teachers the philosophical, or scholastic theology, as it is called, derives its origin, and proceeding hence, passed through various forms and modifications, according to the genius, turn, and erudition of those who embraced it. The same principles gave rise to another species of theology, which was called mystic. And what must seem at first sight surprising here is, that this mystic theology, though formed at the same time, and derived from the same source with the scholastic, yet had a natural tendency to overturn and destroy it. The authors of this mystic science are not known, but the principles from whence it sprung are manifest. Its first promoters proceeded from that known doctrine of the Platonic school, which also was adopted by Origen and his disciples, that the divine nature was diffused through all human souls, or, in other words, that the faculty of reason, from which proceeds the health and vigor of the mind, was an emanation from God into the human soul, and comprehended in it the principles and elements of all truth, human and divine. They denied that men could, by labor or study, excite this celestial flame in their breasts, and therefore, they disapproved highly of the attempts of those who, by definitions, abstract theorems, and profound speculations, endeavored to form distinct notions of truth, and to discover its hidden nature. On the contrary, they maintained, that silence, tranquility, repose, and solitude, accompanied with such acts of mortification as might tend to extenuate and exhaust the body, were the means by which the hidden and internal word was excited to produce its latent virtues, and to instruct men in the knowledge of divine things. For thus they reasoned, they who behold with a noble contempt all human affairs, who turn away their eyes from terrestrial vanities, and shut all the avenues of the outward senses against the contagious influences of a material world, must necessarily return to God when the spirit is thus disengaged from the impediments that prevented that happy union. And in this blessed frame, they not only enjoy inexpressible raptures from their communion with the Supreme Being, but also are invested with the inestimable privilege of contemplating truth undisguised and uncorrupted in its native purity, while others behold it in a vitiated and delusive form. This method of reasoning produced strange effects, and drove many into caves and deserts, where they macerated their bodies with hunger and thirst, and submitted to all the miseries of the severest discipline that a gloomy imagination could prescribe. And it is not improbable that Paul, the first hermit, was rather engaged by this fanatical system, than by the persecution under Decius, to fly into the most solitary deserts of Thebais, where he led, during the space of 90 years, a life more worthy of a savage animal than of a rational being. It is, however, to be observed, that though Paul is placed at the head of the order of hermits, yet that unsociable manner of life was very common in Egypt, Syria, India, and Mesopotamia, not only long before his time, but even before the coming of Christ. And it is still practiced among the Mohammedans, as well as the Christians, in those arid and burning climates. For the glowing atmosphere that surrounds these countries is a natural cause of that love of solitude and repose, of that indolent and melancholy disposition, that are remarkably common among their languid inhabitants. But let us turn away our eyes from these scenes of fanaticism, which are so opprobrious to human nature, and consider some other circumstances that belong more or less to the history of the Christian doctrine during this century. And here it is proper to mention the useful labors of those, who manifested their zeal for the Holy Scriptures by the care they took to have accurate copies of them multiplied everywhere, and that at such moderate prices, as rendered them of easy purchase, as also to have them translated into various languages, and published in correct editions. Many of the more opulent among the Christians contributed generously a great part of their substance to the carrying on of these pious and excellent undertakings. Pionius and Hesychius in Egypt, and Lucian at Antioch, employed much pains in correcting the copies of the Septuagint, and Pamphilus of Caesarea, labored with great diligence and success in works of the same nature, until a glorious martyrdom finished his course. But Origen surpassed all others in diligence and assiduity, and his famous Hexapla, though almost entirely destroyed by the waste of time, will, even in its fragments, remain an eternal monument of the incredible application with which that great man labored to remove those obstacles which retarded the progress of the gospel. After the encomiums we have given to Origen, who has an undoubted right to the first place among the interpreters of the Scriptures in this century, it is not without a deep concern that we are obliged to add, that he also, by an unhappy method, opened a secure retreat for all sorts of errors that a wild and irregular imagination could bring forth. Having entertained a notion that it was extremely difficult, if not impossible, to defend everything contained in the sacred writings from the cavils of heretics and infidels, so long as they were explained literally, according to the real import of the terms, he had recourse to the fecundity of a lively imagination, and maintained that the Holy Scriptures were to be interpreted in the same allegorical manner that the Platonists explained the history of the gods. In consequence of this pernicious rule of interpretation, he alleged that the words of Scripture were, in many places, absolutely void of sense, and that though in others there were, indeed, certain notions conveyed under the outward terms according to their literal force and import, yet it was not in these that the true meaning of the sacred writers was to be sought, but in a mysterious and hidden sense arising from the nature of the things themselves. This hidden sense he endeavors to investigate throughout his commentaries, neglecting and despising, for the most part, the outward letter, and in this devious path he displays the most ingenious strokes of fancy, though always at the expense of truth, whose divine simplicity is scarcely discernible through the cobweb veil of allegory. Nor did the inventions of Origen end here. He divided this hidden sense, which he pursued with such eagerness, into moral and mystical, or spiritual. The moral sense of Scripture displays those doctrines that relate to the inward state of the soul, and the conduct of life. The mystical or spiritual sense represents the nature, the laws, and the history of the spiritual or mystical world. We are not yet at the end of the labyrinth, for he subdivided this mystical world of his own creation into two distinct regions, the one of which he called the superior, i.e., heaven, and the other the inferior, by which he meant the church. This led to another division of the mystical sense into an earthly or allegorical sense, adapted to the inferior world, and a celestial or anagogical one adapted to the superior region. This chimerical method of explaining the Scripture was, before Origen, received by many Christians, who were deluded into it by the example of the Jews. But as this learned man reduced it into a system, and founded it upon fixed and determinate rules, he is, on that account, commonly considered as its principal author. A prodigious number of interpreters, both in this and the succeeding ages, followed the method of Origen, though with some variations, nor could the few, who explained the sacred writings with judgment, and a true spirit of criticism, oppose, with any success, the torrent of allegory that was overflowing the Church. The commentaries of Hippolytus, which are yet extant, show manifestly, that this good man was entirely addicted to the system of Origen, and the same judgment may be hazarded concerning Victorinus's explications of certain books of the Old and New Testament, though these explications are long since lost. The translation of the Ecclesiastes by Gregory Thaumaturgus, which is yet remaining, is not chargeable with this reproach, notwithstanding the tender and warm attachment of its author to Origen. The Book of Genesis and the Song of Solomon were explained by Methodius, whose work is lost, and Ammonius composed a harmony of the Gospels. The doctrinal part of theology employed the pens of many learned men in this century. In his Stramata, and his 4 books of Elements, Origen illustrated the greatest part of the doctrines of Christianity, or, to speak more properly, rather disguised them under the lines of a vain philosophy. These books of Elements or Principles, were the first sketch that appeared of the scholastic or philosophical theology. Something of the same nature was attempted by Theognostus, in his 7 books of Hypotyposes, which are only known at present by the extracts of them in Photius, who represents them as the work of one who was infected with the notions of Origen. Gregory Thaumaturgus drew up a brief summary of the Christian religion, in his exposition of the faith, and many treated, in a more ample manner, particular points of doctrine in opposition to the enemies and corrupters of Christianity. Thus Hippolytus wrote concerning the deity, the resurrection, Antichrist, and the end of the world, Methodius, concerning free will, and Lucian, concerning faith. It is doubtful in what class these productions are to be placed, as the most of them have perished among the ruins of time. Among the moral writers, the first place, after Tertullian, of whom we have already spoken above, is due to Cyprian, a prelate of eminent merit, who published several treatises concerning patience, mortality, works, alms, as also an exhortation to martyrdom. In these dissertations, there are many excellent things, but there runs through them all a general want of order, precision and method, nor do we always find solid proofs in favor of the decisions they contain. Origen has written many treatises of this kind, and among others an exhortation to suffer martyrdom for the truth, a subject handled by many authors in this century, but with unequal eloquence and penetration. Methodius treated of chastity, in a work entitled, Symposium Virginum, or, The Feast of Virgins, but this treatise is full of confusion and disorder. Dionysius handled the doctrine of penance and temptations. The other moral writers of this period are too obscure and trivial to render the mention of them necessary. The controversial writers were exceeding numerous in this century. The pagans were attacked, and that in a victorious manner, by Minucius Felix, in his dialogue called Octavius, by Origen, in his writings against Celsus, by Arnobius, in his 7 books against the Gentiles, and Cyprian, in his treatise concerning the vanity of idols. The Chronicle of Hippolytus, in opposition to the Gentiles, and the work of Methodius against Porphyry, that bitter adversary of the Christians, are both lost. We may also reckon, in the number of the polemic writers, those who wrote against the philosophers, or who treated any subjects that were disputed between different sections. Such was Hippolytus, who wrote against Plato, and who also treated the nicest, the most difficult, and the most controverted subjects, such as fate, free will, and the origin of evil, which exercised, likewise, the pens of Methodius and other acute writers. What Hippolytus wrote against the Jews, is not come down to our times, but the work of Cyprian, upon that subject, yet remains. Origen, Victorinus, Hippolytus, attacked, in general, all various sects and heresies that divided the Church, but their labors in that immense field, have entirely disappeared, and as to those, who only turned their controversial arms against some few sects, and certain particular doctrines, we think it not necessary to enumerate them here. It is, however, necessary to observe, that the methods now used of defending Christianity, and attacking Judaism and idolatry, degenerated much from the primitive simplicity, and the true rule of controversy. The Christian doctors, who had been educated in the schools of the rhetoricians and sophists, rashly employed the arts and evasions of their subtle masters in the service of Christianity, and, intent only upon defeating the enemy, they were too little attentive to the means of victory, indifferent whether they acquired it by artifice or plain dealing. This method of disputing, which the ancients called economical, and which had victory for its object, rather than truth, was, in consequence of the prevailing taste for rhetoric and sophistry, almost universally approved. The Platonists contributed to the support and encouragement of this ungenerous method of disputing, by that maxim of theirs which asserted the innocence of defending the truth by artifice and falsehood. This will appear manifest to those who have read, with any manner of penetration and judgment, the arguments of Origen against Celsus, and those of the other Christian disputants against the idolatrous Gentiles. The method of Tertullian, who used to plead prescription against erroneous doctors, was not, perhaps, unfair in this century, but they must be much unacquainted both with the times, and, indeed, with the nature of things, who imagine that it is always allowable to employ this method. This disingenuous and vicious method of surprising their adversaries by artifice, and striking them down, as it were, by lies and fictions, produced, among other disagreeable effects, a great number of books, which were falsely attributed to certain great men, in order to give these spurious productions more credit and weight. For, as the greatest part of mankind are less governed by reason than by authority, and prefer, in many cases, the decisions of fallible mortals to the unerring dictates of the divine word, the disputants, of whom we are now speaking, thought they could not serve the truth more effectually than by opposing illustrious names and respectable authorities to the attacks of its adversaries. Hence, the Book of Canons, which certain artful men ascribed falsely to the apostles, hence, the apostolical constitutions, of which Clement, Bishop of Rome, is said to have formed a collection, hence the Recognitions and the Clementina, which are also attributed to Clement, and many other productions of that nature, which, for a long time, were too much esteemed by credulous men. Nor were the managers of controversy the only persons who employed these stratagems. The mystics had recourse to the same pious frauds to support their sect. And, accordingly, when they were asked from what chief their establishment took its rise, to get clear of this perplexing question, they feigned a chief, and chose, for that purpose, Dionysius the Areopagite, a man of almost apostolical weight and authority, who was converted to Christianity, in the 1st century, by the preaching of St. Paul at Athens. And to render this fiction more specious, they attributed to this great man various treatises concerning the monastic life, the mystic theology, and other subjects of that nature, which were the productions of some senseless and insipid writers of after times. Thus it happened, through the pernicious influence of human passions, which too often mingle themselves with the execution of the best purposes and the most upright intentions, that they, who were desirous of surpassing all others in piety, looked upon it as lawful, and even laudable, to advance the cause of piety by artifice and fraud. The most famous controversies that divided the Christians during this century, were those concerning the millennium, or reign of 1,000 years, the baptism of heretics, and the doctrine of Origen. Long before this period, an opinion had prevailed that Christ was to come and reign 1,000 years among men, before the entire and final dissolution of this world. This opinion, which had hitherto met with no opposition, was differently interpreted by different persons, nor did all promise themselves the same kind of enjoyments in that future and glorious kingdom. But in this century its credit began to decline, principally through the influence and authority of Origen, who opposed it with the greatest warmth, because it was incompatible with some of his favorite sentiments. Nepos, an Egyptian bishop, endeavored to restore this opinion to its former credit, in a book written against the allegorists, for so he called, by way of contempt, the adversaries of the millenarian system. This work, and the hypothesis it defended, was extremely well received by great numbers in the canton of Arsino, and among others by Caratian, a presbyter of no mean influence and reputation. But Dionysius of Alexandria, a disciple of Origen, stopped the growing progress of this doctrine by his private discourse, and also by 2 learned and judicious dissertations concerning the divine promises. The disputes concerning the baptism of heretics were not carried on with that amiable spirit of candor, moderation, and impartiality with which Dionysius opposed the millenarian doctrine. The warmth and violence that were exerted in this controversy, were far from being edifying to such as were acquainted with the true genius of Christianity, and with that meekness and forbearance that should particularly distinguish its doctors. As there was no express law which determined the manner and form, according to which those who abandoned the heretical sects were to be received into the communion of the Church, the rules practiced in this matter were not the same in all Christian churches. Many of the Oriental and African Christians placed recanting heretics in the rank of catechumens, and admitted them, by baptism, into the communion of the faithful, while the greatest part of the European churches, considering the baptism of heretics as valid, used no other forms in their reception than the imposition of hands, accompanied with solemn prayer. This diversity prevailed for a long time without kindling contentions or animosities. But, at length, charity waxed cold, and the fire of ecclesiastical discord broke out. In this century, the Asiatic Christians came to a determination in a point that was hitherto, in some measure, undecided, and in more than one council established it as a law, that all heretics were to be rebaptized before their admission to the communion of the true Church. When Stephen, Bishop of Rome, was informed of this determination, he behaved with the most unchristian violence and arrogance toward the Asiatic Christians, broke communion with them, and excluded them from the communion of the Church of Rome. These haughty proceedings made no impression upon Cyprian Bishop of Carthage, who, notwithstanding the menaces of the Roman pontiff, assembled a council on this occasion, adopted, with the rest of the African bishops, the opinion of the Asiatics, and gave notice thereof to the imperious Stephen. The fury of the latter was redoubled at this notification, and produced many threatenings and invectives against Cyprian, who replied, with great force and resolution, and in a second council held at Carthage, declared the baptism, administered by heretics, void of all efficacy and validity. Upon this, the choler of Stephen swelled beyond measure, and, by a decree full of invectives, which was received with contempt, he excommunicated the African bishops, whose moderation, on the one hand, and the death of their imperious antagonist on the other, put an end to the violent controversy. The controversy concerning Origen was set in motion by Demetrius, Bishop of Alexandria, animated, as some say, by a principle of envy and hatred against this learned man, with whom he had formerly lived in an intimate friendship. The assertion, however, of those who attribute the opposition of Demetrius to this odious principle, appears something more than doubtful, for in the whole of his conduct toward Origen, there are no visible marks of envy, though many indeed of passion and arrogance, of violence and injustice. The occasion of all this was as follows: in the year 228, Origen having set out for Achaia, was, in his journey thither, received with singular marks of affection and esteem by the bishops of Caesarea and Jerusalem, who ordained him presbyter by imposition of hands. This proceeding gave high offense to Demetrius, who declared Origen unworthy of the priesthood, because he had castrated himself, and maintained, at the same time, that it was not lawful to advance, to a higher dignity, the principal of the Alexandrian school, which was under his episcopal inspection, without his knowledge and approbation. A conclusion, however, was put to these warm debates, and Origen returned to Alexandria. This calm was, indeed, but of a short duration, being soon succeeded by a new breach between him and Demetrius, the occasion of which is not known, but which grew to such a height as obliged Origen, in the year 231, to abandon his charge at Alexandria, and retire to Caesarea. His absence, however, did not appease the resentment of Demetrius, who continued to persecute him with the utmost violence. To satisfy fully his vengeance against Origen, he assembled 2 councils, in the first of which he condemned him unheard, and deprived him of his office, and in the second, had him degraded from the sacerdotal dignity. It is probable, that in one of these councils, especially the latter, Demetrius accused him of erroneous sentiments in matters of religion, for it was about this time that Origen published his book of Principles, which contains several opinions of a dangerous tendency. The greatest part of the Christian bishops approved of the proceedings of the Alexandrian Council, against which the bishops of the churches of Achaia, Palestine, Phoenicia, and Arabia,